Tonight, we travel to the wide open plains of North America, where winter settles quietly across the land and a circle of tipis stands against the pale horizon, their shapes steady and still beneath the falling snow. Take a slow breath now. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day you have just come through begin to fade gently into the background, like the last light of the sun disappearing beyond a wide, flat horizon. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. There is nowhere you need to be. There is only this quiet journey, this soft and unhurried story unfolding slowly in the winter dark. Imagine a great plain stretching out in every direction, not a threatening or overwhelming openness, but a wide, peaceful one, the kind of space that invites your eyes to rest and your mind to slow down. The land is covered in snow, a soft, even blanket of white that has been falling gently for several days. It has smoothed the edges of the earth, filling small hollows, softening the shapes of dried grasses that still push through here and there in thin, pale clusters. The ground is quiet beneath its covering. The sky above is a deep, darkening blue, moving slowly toward the full dark of evening. And there, gathered in a gentle curve along the shelter of a low river valley, a group of tipis stands, perhaps 10 of them, perhaps 15. Their conical shapes rise clearly against the snow and sky, their poles crossing at the top, their hides muted in color, creamy, buff, softly patterned in places, each one glowing faintly from within where the fire inside burns low and warm. Thin lines of smoke rise from the openings at the tops of the lodges, climbing straight for a little while in the still air, then curving softly and drifting away into the darkening sky. This is where we begin tonight, in this quiet camp, in this winter evening. In the warm and sheltered interior of a winter tipi, where people have gathered around a small fire, where children are listening to soft voices, where the cold of the plains outside is held back by careful design and patient knowledge, and where the night moves gently toward the deep, restful hours of sleep. Let yourself settle as we begin. This story has no hurry in it. It moves at the pace of snow falling, at the pace of fire burning slowly down to coals, at the pace of breath deepening into sleep. You are welcome to close your eyes whenever it feels right. You are welcome simply to listen and to let the words carry you to that warm, still place where the snow falls outside and the fire glows within. The Great Plains in winter, the Great Plains of North America, are a vast and remarkable landscape. They stretch from the southern regions of what is now Canada, downward through a great swath of the central continent, all the way to the warmer, drier lands of the south. East to west, they extend from the edge of the eastern woodlands to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, where the flat land finally begins its long, gradual rise toward the peaks. In every direction, the scale of this place is extraordinary. The sky here is enormous, larger seeming than almost anywhere else, because there is so little to interrupt the view between the eye and the horizon. In winter, the Great Plains take on a quality of stillness that is unlike almost any other season. The great herds of bison have gathered into smaller, quieter groups in sheltered valleys and low, wooded areas. The grasses have died back, their long stems now pale and dry or buried entirely beneath the snow. The rivers have slowed, their surfaces icing over at the edges and in the shallower stretches, while the central currents continue their quiet movement beneath the freeze. The cottonwood trees along the riverbanks stand bare, their gray-white trunks and branches making delicate patterns against the winter sky, holding the last few leaves that the autumn winds did not take. On a clear winter day, the light on the plains has a particular quality that is difficult to describe but immediately felt. It is low and golden, even at midday, coming from a sun that does not climb high in the winter sky, but instead moves in a long, shallow arc close to the horizon. This low light falls across the snow at a slanting angle, casting long, soft shadows from every small rise and drift and dried stem, so that the landscape becomes a world of gentle texture, all pale gold and cool blue shadow, stretching endlessly in both directions. The cold, on the open plains, comes sometimes with wind and sometimes without it. When the wind is still, the cold is a clean, quiet presence, a sharpness in the air that presses gently against exposed skin, that makes breath visible as small, soft clouds. There is a kind of clarity to a windless cold day on the plains that can feel almost peaceful, even beautiful, though the temperature may be very low. The snow in those moments is undisturbed, its surface smooth and gently crusted, unmarked, except where animals have passed or where the camp has spread its patterns of footprints and dog tracks. When the wind moves, the experience of winter on the plains shifts. Wind here has a long reach, nothing to stop it as it sweeps across the open land, gathering speed over miles of open country. But even then, in a well-chosen camp, sheltered by the curve of a valley or the bend of a river and its fringe of trees, the worst of the wind can be softened considerably. The camp becomes a pocket of relative calm within the larger motion of the air. The tipis, arranged to offer each other some small mutual protection, hold their ground with the patience that their design has given them. Snow falls on the plains in many different ways. There are quiet, still snows, the kind that drift down from a pale sky without any wind, each flake falling in its own slow and independent path, settling so gently on the ground that the only sound is a faint, almost inaudible whisper that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There are heavier snows, when the flakes are large and soft and fall quickly, accumulating invisible layers on every surface, rounding the shapes of everything in the camp, gathering on the tops of the tipi poles, collecting in soft drifts against the windward sides of the lodges. And there are occasional hard, driving snows when the wind and cold come together and the air is full of horizontal white, when people move quickly between their tasks and the animals turn their backs to the weather and the camp pulls inward, each tipi a self-contained island of warmth in a whirling world. But these harder moments pass. They are part of the winter, part of what the winter is, but they are not the whole of it. Most winter days on the plains are simply cold and quiet, the sky a gray or pale blue overhead, the snow lying still and white in all directions, the camp going about its business in the measured, unhurried way that winter life encourages. The silence of the winter plains at night is something that must be experienced slowly to be appreciated. After the camp has settled and the fires have burned low and the dogs have curled into their sleeping places and the last voice has spoken its last soft word of the day, there is a quiet that descends over the entire landscape. The stars, where they are visible between clouds, are very bright and very numerous in this air, this far from any other light. They do not flicker so much as they glow, steadily and clearly, arranged in their ancient patterns above the white ground. The only sound might be the very faint settling of snow somewhere in the camp, or the distant, liquid call of a coyote carrying across the plain from far away, or the quiet creak of a lodgepole pine shifting in the cold. These sounds do not disturb the silence. They are part of it, threads woven into its fabric. This is the world in which the peoples of the plains made their winter lives. Not despite the cold and the snow and the wide openness, but within them, working with the particular qualities of this landscape, using their knowledge of its patterns and rhythms to live well in every season. Who used tipis? Before we go further into the warmth of the winter tipi, it is worth pausing to speak gently and respectfully about the people who called this landscape home, who developed the tipi and the way of life that accompanied it over many generations of patient and intelligent living on the plains. The peoples we are speaking of were many and varied. Each nation had its own language, its own stories, its own ceremonies, its own way of understanding the world and their place within it. What they shared, broadly, was a way of life organized around the seasonal movements of the bison herds that once roamed the plains in vast numbers, and a home, the tipi, that was beautifully suited to that mobile, seasonally responsive way of living. Among the peoples most associated with the classic tipi culture of the northern and central plains were the Lakota, sometimes called the Sioux, a word that comes from a neighboring language and was used by outsiders, though the people themselves used many names for their different bands and nations. The Lakota lived and ranged across a broad region of the northern plains and spoke of their home as their homeland in the fullest sense, a land known intimately across many generations. Their tipis were large and well constructed, and their knowledge of how to live well on the plains through all seasons was deep and sophisticated. The Cheyenne were another Great Plains people, ranging over a wide territory that took them from the northern to the central plains in different seasons. The Cheyenne were known for, among many things, their skill in working with horses, which had transformed the life of many plains peoples in the centuries following the horses' return to North America. With horses, the range of movement possible for a camp expanded greatly, and the ability to follow bison herds and to transport the heavy tipi coverings and long poles became much more practical. The Blackfoot Confederacy, living in the northern plains and foothills regions, where winters could be long and cold, developed particularly strong traditions of winter living. Their knowledge of where to find sheltered camps, how to manage their herds of horses through the cold months, and how to maintain their lodges against the northern winter was accumulated across many generations and expressed in the careful, confident way they organized their seasonal lives. The Comanche ranged primarily across the southern and central plains, where winters were generally milder, but could still bring cold snaps and snow. They were extraordinary equestrians, known across the plains for their skill with horses and their ability to move quickly and efficiently across great distances was a defining characteristic of their way of life. Their tipis were adapted to these patterns of movement, and their winter camps were organized with the same attention to shelter and warmth that characterized all the plains peoples. The Crow, the Kiowa, the Arapaho, the Assiniboine, and many others. Each of these nations brought their own particular knowledge and traditions to their way of living on the plains, and each developed the tipi as their central home in ways that reflected their specific landscapes, their specific patterns of movement, and their specific understandings of what comfort and shelter meant. It would be a simplification to speak of all these peoples as if they were one group with one way of life. They were many, distinct and varied, each with a rich and irreplaceable culture. What we are doing here is drawing gently on some common threads that appear across many of their traditions, particularly around the design and use of the winter tipi, while acknowledging that each specific tradition had its own details, its own refinements, its own specific knowledge that went far beyond what any general description can capture. The ethnographic record, gathered from the accounts of people who lived this life, from the careful work of scholars who listened and documented, and from the oral traditions that the descendants of these nations still carry today, gives us a picture of tipi life that is rich with specific, practical detail. The number of poles, the way the cover was raised, the direction the door faced, the arrangement of sleeping places, the management of the smoke flaps. All of these things were known, practiced, and passed on across generations, and they add up to a picture of a domestic tradition that was sophisticated, comfortable, and beautifully suited to the landscape it arose from. Why tipis were designed the way they were the tipi is a remarkable piece of design. It looks simple at first, a cone of hides over a frame of poles. But each element of that cone, each decision about angle and proportion and material and arrangement, reflects a deep understanding of how to stay warm and comfortable in a windy, open, cold environment. The most basic feature of the tipi is its shape. A cone, or more precisely, a slightly tilted cone, with the back leaning toward the rear and the front rising more steeply, so that the smoke hole at the top is naturally positioned away from the prevailing wind, and the interior space is distributed to allow more room in the back, where people sleep, and less near the door. This tilted cone shape is not incidental. It is the result of long refinement, of generations of people noticing how the smoke moved in different wind conditions, how the lodge held warmth, how the poles settled and stabilized, and adjusting the proportions accordingly until the design was as good as it could be. The number of poles used in a tipi varied across different nations and different sizes of lodge, but generally fell between 12 and 20, with additional shorter poles used to control the smoke flaps. These poles were typically of lodgepole pine, chosen for their straightness, their length, and their relative lightness relative to their strength. A good tipi pole might be 6 or 7 meters long, or even longer for a large lodge, straight enough along its whole length to lie flush against the others when the lodge was assembled. Selecting, preparing, and maintaining a good set of poles was an important investment, and poles were cared for, carried on the travois during moves, and used for many years. The foundation of a tipi frame was often laid by setting 3 or 4 poles together in a specific arrangement, either a tripod or a 4-pole foundation, and lashing them together near the top with a strong length of rope or sinew. This base was then raised upright, the poles spread to their proper positions on the ground, and the remaining poles were laid into the initial framework one by one, each one finding its natural resting place in the crook formed by the first poles. The result was a structure that was self-supporting and stable, the weight of the poles pressing against each other in a balanced arrangement so that no single pole bore more than its share. When all the poles were in place, the cover was lifted. The cover, made of sewn buffalo hides, was attached to a lifting pole and raised to the back of the frame, then wrapped around the front and secured with wooden pins along the vertical smoke flap opening at the front. The bottom edge of the cover was staked or weighted to hold it close to the ground. The door, a separate piece of hide, was hung or propped in the doorway, which in most traditions faced east. The resulting structure, when properly set, was stable, weatherproof, and spacious. A good-sized tipi for a family might be 5 or 6 meters in diameter at the base, with a ceiling height at the center of 3 meters or more. The interior felt larger than those dimensions might suggest because of the curving walls and the open, uncluttered floor space. For winter, the tipi was prepared with additional care. The inner liner, sometimes called the dew cloth, was a crucial feature. This was a separate piece of hide or tan material, typically about the height of a seated or standing person, that was hung from the poles along the interior of the lodge. It created a double wall through a significant portion of the Tipis' circumference, enclosing a narrow air gap between itself and the outer cover. This air gap was an effective insulator, reducing the passage of cold from the outside to the inside. The liner also served to redirect cold air that crept under the base of the outer cover. Rather than flowing directly into the living space, it was channeled downward behind the liner and then drawn upward toward the fire by the natural circulation the fire created. The inner liner was often decorated. Geometric patterns, images of animals, scenes from important events, or symbolic designs were painted or worked into the liner, so that the interior of the tipi was a richly visual space, the walls around the living area telling stories and marking identity through color and pattern. In the firelight, these designs moved and lived, their colors shifting with the dancing light, making the interior of the lodge a warm and visually enveloping place. The smoke flaps at the top of the tipi were controlled by poles that remained outside the lodge, held by people or propped at the right angles to direct the flaps as needed. By opening or closing the flaps and adjusting their angle relative to the wind, the inhabitants could control how well the smoke was drawn up and out of the lodge, how much air entered, and how much of the fire's heat was retained within the interior. This was a continuous, responsive process, not a set-and-forget arrangement. The flaps were adjusted throughout the day and evening as wind conditions changed, and as the fire was managed at different intensities. On a still, cold winter night, with the flaps arranged to draw the smoke gently out and the fire burning low and steady, the interior of a well-made tipi could be genuinely warm and comfortable, the air clear enough to breathe easily, the walls blocking the cold and holding the warmth close. Buffalo hide construction and insulation, the hides of the bison were the primary building material of the tipi, and understanding how those hides were prepared and used helps explain why the tipi was such an effective winter shelter. A bison hide is a large and heavy piece of material. An adult bison bull could carry a hide weighing many kilograms, thick and dense, with the hair that helped the animal survive the plains winter. The hide of a cow, lighter and more pliable, was often preferred for tipi covers and for robes, as it was easier to work with and produced a softer, finished material. Preparing a hide for tipi use required many hours of skilled labor, typically carried out by the women of the household, whose knowledge of hide working was one of the central crafts of plains life. The process began with staking the fresh hide out flat on the ground, stretching it as evenly as possible so it would dry without folding or curling. While it was still fresh and workable, the flesh side was scraped with a bone or stone scraper to remove remaining fat and tissue. This scraping was thorough and patient work, covering every part of the hide's surface to ensure that no organic material remained that might decay or attract insects. Then the hide was allowed to dry completely, becoming stiff and firm. In this state, it was called rawhide, and it had its own uses as a hard, durable material for containers, shields, and various other objects. For a soft, workable hide suitable for tipi covers and robes, further processing was required. Brain matter from the animal or other fat-rich substances was worked thoroughly into the hide while it was still slightly damp, softening and lubricating the fibers. Then the hide was worked repeatedly, pulled back and forth over a rope or sinew stretched between two posts, or rubbed and kneaded by hand, hour after hour, until the fibers had separated and the material had become soft and pliable. This process of softening could take many sessions over several days, and the result was a beautifully soft, cream-colored material that would remain flexible and durable through many seasons of use. For a tipi cover large enough to shelter a family, many hides were needed, typically somewhere between 10 and 20, depending on the size of the lodge. These hides were sewn together with strong sinew thread, using a bone needle in careful, tight seams that would resist wind and weather. The cut and assembly of the hides into the distinctive half-cone shape of the cover was skilled work, each piece cut precisely so that when assembled and lifted onto the poles, the cover would hang evenly and the seams would fall in the right places. The finished tipi cover had a quality that modern manufactured materials rarely match. It was breathable, allowing some moisture vapor to pass through, which helped prevent condensation from building up inside. It was insulating, the thick hide retaining warmth effectively. It was strong and windproof when tightly staked and pinned, and it was repairable, damaged sections being replaced or patched without the need to replace the whole cover. A good tipi cover, well maintained, could last for years, its color deepening gradually with smoke and use, its surface acquiring a patina that spoke of many seasons and many camps. For sleeping and for additional warmth inside, the tipi buffalo robes were perhaps the single most important item of the winter household. A buffalo robe was a whole hide, or sometimes the hide of a younger animal, prepared with the hair left on one side and the flesh side tanned to softness. Worn or wrapped with the hair side in, it captured the body's own heat and held it close. Spread on the ground with the hair side up, it created a warm, soft, sleeping surface. Pulled over the body at night, one or more robes could maintain comfortable warmth, even when the fire had burned very low. The hair of the bison was itself a superb insulator, evolved over millennia to protect the animal in exactly the same cold environment that the people were living in. It was dense and slightly curled, with a structure that trapped air between the individual hairs, creating an insulating layer similar in principle to the down of a bird, though heavier and more durable. Sleeping beneath a buffalo robe on a winter night was, in many accounts from those who experienced it, genuinely warm and comfortable, the weight and softness of the robe contributing to a sense of being held and sheltered that encouraged deep and restful sleep. Setting up a winter camp, choosing where to make a winter camp, was a decision that reflected accumulated knowledge of the landscape, the weather, and the resources available in different places at different times of year. People who had ranged a particular territory for generations built up a detailed understanding of which locations offered the best combination of shelter from the wind, access to firewood, proximity to water, and proximity to the areas where bison could be found in winter. River valleys were often favored for winter camps. The valley itself provided some shelter from the prevailing winds. The cottonwood trees that grew along rivers were a source of firewood, their dry wood burning well and their inner bark providing emergency fodder for horses in lean periods. The river, even when partially frozen, offered water that was more accessible than snow, which required melting over fire and consumed fuel in the process. And bison, in winter, also sought the shelter of valleys, so that a camp set in a good river valley might find its people close to the resources they needed for their winter living. The setting up of a winter camp was a practiced, coordinated activity that a group could accomplish with impressive efficiency. Once a site had been chosen, the process of establishing the camp followed familiar patterns. The ground where each lodge would stand was cleared of snow if necessary, and the configuration of the camp, which direction each door would face, how the lodges would be arranged relative to each other, was determined by custom and practical sense, taking into account the direction of the prevailing wind, the terrain, and the relationships between the families who would be camping together. Each family's tipi was their own responsibility to erect. The poles were unloaded from the travois and laid out, sorted and counted. The foundation poles were set first, lifted and placed in their positions, spread to their proper spacing on the ground. The remaining poles were added in sequence, each one lifting and resting against the foundation, filling out the frame until all the poles were in place. The cover was then raised on its lifting pole, drawn up to the back of the frame, and wrapped forward, the front edges brought together and pinned with the wooden pins that served as lacing pegs. Stakes were driven through loops in the base edge to hold the cover close to the ground. Then the interior work began. The inner liner was hung, running around the inside of the poles at the base level to create that insulating double wall. Bedding was laid out in each person's sleeping place. The hearth was prepared at the center, a circle of stones or a prepared area where the fire would be built. Household items, cooking vessels, tools, stored food, personal bundles were arranged in their customary places around the interior. The door hide was hung, and finally the fire was lit and the lodge began to warm. When all the lodges of the camp had been raised and their fires established, the camp took on a settled, inhabited quality. The smell of wood smoke spread through the cold air. The dogs circled and settled. Children moved between the lodges. Horses, staked or hobbled in the nearby area, stood quietly in the cold, their breath forming clouds around their heads. The sounds of human activity, the quiet conversations, the soft movements, the occasional sound of wood being split or water being poured, filled the camp with a gentle domestic texture. From a little distance, the camp looked exactly as it was, a small, ordered circle of human life in the wide, open winter landscape, warm and self-contained within the cold, holding its own against the season not through force, but through knowledge, preparation, and design. The central fire and hearth placement, the fire inside the tipi, was its heart. Everything in the interior was arranged in relation to the fire. The sleeping places, the cooking area, the social life of the household, the flow of warm air through the lodge. Without the fire, the tipi was simply a shelter from wind. With it, it became a home. The hearth was typically positioned near the center of the tipi floor, though placed slightly toward the door side of center to position the smoke column most effectively beneath the smoke hole opening above. The hearth itself was often formed by a ring of stones, arranged in a loose circle to contain the fire and to concentrate its heat. In some traditions, the stones were chosen carefully for their ability to absorb and hold heat, so that even after the flames had died down, the stones would continue to radiate warmth into the air of the lodge for some time. The fire inside a winter tipi was managed with attention and care. It was not built large. A large, hot fire would produce too much smoke, would dry the air excessively, and would be wasteful of the firewood that had to be gathered and carried in. A smaller fire, built from dry, selected wood and fed steadily, would produce good heat with less smoke, maintain a more comfortable and breathable interior atmosphere, and make the available fuel supply last longer. The art of managing a tipi fire was something that children absorbed from watching adults, learning gradually by observation and then by practice, which would burn how to stack the fuel to maintain a steady burn, how to bank the coals for the night so that morning would bring a quick revival rather than a cold hearth. Hardwoods, where available, were particularly valued for cooking fires because they burned longer and produced better coals than soft woods. Cottonwood, which was the most commonly available tree along the river valleys of the plains, was a softer wood but readily available and quite usable. Dried bison chips, the dried dung of the bison, were an important fuel source in areas where wood was scarce, and they burned surprisingly well, producing a steady, relatively clean heat that was well suited to the tipi fire. The heat produced by the central fire circulated through the tipi in a natural pattern. Warm air rose from the fire and collected in the upper portion of the tipi, where it was eventually drawn out through the smoke hole. At the same time, cool air entered at the base, through any small gaps or through the door flap when it was briefly opened. This circulation created a gentle but continuous movement of air through the lodge that helped carry smoke upward and out, while maintaining warmth in the lower portion of the interior, where people sat and slept. The stones of the hearth held their heat long after the last flame had died, and the coals had dimmed to a dull glow. On winter nights, this retained warmth in the stones was a meaningful contribution to the overall comfort of the sleeping space. The ground immediately around the hearth was the warmest sleeping territory in the lodge, and it was typically occupied by those most in need of warmth. The very young and the very old, or anyone who was unwell and in need of extra comfort. Wood was often brought inside the tipi and stacked near the door, within easy reach but protected from snow. A good supply of dry fuel kept close meant that adding to the fire during the night required no cold trip outside, no extended absence from the warmth of the sleeping robes. A hand would emerge from beneath the covers, reach for a piece of wood, lay it gently across the coals, and withdraw again. The fire would accept the new fuel slowly, the coals glowing brighter as the wood caught, a small flame rising, the light in the lodge strengthening briefly before the person who had tended it settled back to sleep. Smoke flaps and airflow design at the top of the tipi, the smoke hole was the feature that made everything else work. Without an effective way for smoke to leave the interior, the fire would be a source of discomfort rather than warmth, filling the lodge with a haze that stung the eyes and made breathing difficult. The smoke hole and the smoke flaps that controlled it were the engineering solution to this problem, and they were a refined and effective solution. The smoke flaps were extensions of the outer tipi cover that projected upward above the main body of the lodge on either side of the front opening. Each flap was attached at its base to the cover and free at its upper edge. A pole longer than the height of the lodge and held by a person standing outside or propped in position could be attached to the outer corner of each flap and used to angle it in different positions. By adjusting the two flap poles independently, the opening at the top of the tipi could be made larger or smaller, angled to the left or right, and oriented relative to the wind direction in a precise way that influenced how effectively smoke was drawn upward and out. On a calm day, with no wind to aid the draw, the flaps might be opened wide, creating the largest possible smoke hole, and the fire managed at a steady, moderate level that produced enough heat differential between interior and exterior air to keep the smoke moving upward. On a windy day, the flaps were angled so that the moving air passed across the opening in a way that created suction, drawing the smoke out more actively. Too much suction, however, and the fire might burn too fast, too little, and smoke would back up into the lodge. The adjustment of the flaps was an ongoing, attentive process, done by feel and by watching the smoke's behavior. In a rainstorm or during heavy snow, the flaps could be drawn together and partially closed to prevent precipitation from falling directly into the fire. In deep cold with no wind, when conservation of heat was most important, the flaps could be set to allow just enough draw for the smoke to clear, minimizing the amount of warm air lost through the top of the lodge. The inner liner, as mentioned earlier, played a role in airflow as well. By directing the cool air that entered at the base of the tipi into the space behind the liner rather than directly into the living area, the liner helped ensure that the air people breathed near the floor was not the coldest incoming air, but air that had already been somewhat warmed by its contact with the fire and the retained heat of the lodge. This gentle management of air movement was one of the subtler but genuinely effective features of the Tipis winter performance. People who had grown up in Tipis understood all of this intuitively, the way a skilled musician understands an instrument, not necessarily through analytical knowledge of acoustics, but through a lifetime of attentive relationship with the instrument's responses, its moods, its possibilities. They read the smoke the way others read the sky, as information about what was happening and what adjustments were needed. Bedding and sleeping arrangements, when evening came and the work of the day settled into quietness, the sleeping arrangements inside the tipi became the central organization of the lodge's interior space. Each person had a customary place to sleep, arranged around the perimeter of the tipi in the space between the inner liner and the central fire area. The sleeping places were not rigidly assigned so much as they were organically established over the life of the household, each person finding and keeping their comfortable position in the circle. The head of the household typically slept in the honored position at the back of the tipi, directly opposite the door, which was the place furthest from drafts and the most sheltered from any cold air that might enter through the doorway. Important personal items, a sacred bundle, a shield, items of ceremonial significance, might be kept near this position, hung from the poles above or placed on a small raised platform of wood to keep them off the ground. Sleeping platforms or backrests made of willow rods woven together into a flexible mat were common features of the tipi interior. These could be adjusted to support the back and shoulders of someone sitting near the fire, or laid flat to serve as a slightly raised sleeping surface, lifting the body just a little from the cold ground and allowing air to circulate beneath. The willow rods, being a flexible, lightweight material, provided a surface that was firm enough to be supportive, but had enough give to be comfortable even without thick padding beneath. The bedding itself was built up from several layers. Against the ground first, or over the sleeping platform if one was used, a layer of grass or plant material might be spread, providing basic insulation from the cold earth. Over this went one or more tanned hides, hair side up, soft and warm against the skin. Then the sleeping robe, a large, full buffalo hide with its hair left on, was either spread beneath the sleeper or wrapped around them like a sleeping bag, with additional robes pulled over for warmth as needed. A person sleeping in several layers of buffalo robes on a grass and hide platform close to the embers of a well-managed fire would be genuinely warm and comfortable through even a very cold night. The communal sleeping arrangement within the tipi had both practical and social dimensions. Bodies close together generated shared warmth. The sounds of others breathing, shifting, occasionally murmuring in their sleep, created a background of human presence that many people find deeply reassuring, especially through long winter nights. Parents knew without effort where their children were. Grandparents were close to grandchildren. The whole household existed in a proximity that was, by the standards of most modern living, very intimate, but that was simply the normal texture of life for people who shared a lodge. Children who woke in the night found themselves surrounded by warmth and familiar presence. The sounds they heard were the sounds of their family, the breath of their mother beside them, the soft snore of an elder across the fire, the creak of the lodge poles in a wind gust, the faint crackle of an ember. These sounds were the sounds of safety, of home, and they drew the waking child back to sleep almost without resistance. Layering with animal skins, the principle of layering was as important to personal warmth inside and outside the tipi as it was to the construction of the lodge itself. Just as the tipi used an outer cover, an air gap, and an inner liner to create a graduated resistance to cold, the people who lived inside dressed and slept in multiple layers that worked together to maintain warmth, while allowing the body to manage its own temperature as activities changed. Day clothing on the plains in winter was substantial and carefully made. Close to the body, a person might wear a soft shirt of tanned deer hide or lighter bison hide, worn against the skin where its softness would not chafe. Over this, heavier garments, leggings of thick hide, a robe or coat, moccasins lined with fur or extra material that provided insulation against the cold ground. The outer robe, worn loosely or wrapped close as conditions required, was the primary garment of winter, and its design allowed it to be adjusted quickly, opened at the front to cool when engaged in active work, drawn close to conserve heat when moving more slowly, or wrapped fully around the body and held in place when sitting or standing still. Moccasins for winter were often double-soled and lined with dried grass or soft fur that provided both insulation and a slight cushioning against hard ground. Keeping the feet warm was a priority understood through long experience, and the care put into winter footwear reflected that understanding. Mittens of heavy hide or fur protected the hands. Hoods of fur kept the head and neck warm against the cold. Each of these garments was the work of patient hands, measured, cut, sewn with careful stitches using bone needles and sinew thread, and fitted to the body of the wearer. At night, the transition from day clothing to sleeping arrangements was a practical ritual. Outer garments were removed and folded or hung to keep them dry and ready for morning. Some items, perhaps an inner shirt or leggings, might be kept on for warmth during sleep. The sleeping robe was prepared, layers arranged, and the person settled in for the night, pulling the buffalo robe over themselves and allowing the accumulated warmth of the lodge, the fire, and the surrounding family to complete the work of keeping them warm until morning. Children were dressed with particular attention to warmth. Small moccasins were made to fit small feet, lined well against the cold. Small robes and blankets were prepared for small bodies. The care of children's clothing was a constant, ongoing task, as children grew quickly and garments that fit well in one season might be too small the next. The knowledge of how to make and maintain these garments was transmitted carefully from those who knew to those who were learning. Watching a grandmother or mother at work with needle and sinew, following the shape of a garment from its beginning to its finished form, understanding how a seam needed to be placed to prevent stress and allow movement. This was an education in craft that built up, slowly and thoroughly, over many years of observation and practice. Children sleeping in the tipi, there is something particularly peaceful about the image of children sleeping inside a warm winter tipi. Small forms wrapped in soft robes, their faces relaxed and quiet in the low firelight, their breathing slow and even, the cold of the plains existing as a gentle sound against the outer walls rather than a felt presence where they lay. Children in the tipi community were never far from adults. From the earliest infancy, a baby was kept close to its mother's body, often in a soft carrier worn against the chest or back, or wrapped with the mother in her robe. The warmth of an adult body was the primary warmth of an infant's world, supplemented by the fire and the enclosed space of the lodge. This closeness was not only warmth, but comfort, the familiar heartbeat and breath of the parent creating a baseline of security that allowed the infant to rest deeply. As children grew old enough to be aware of the world around them, the tipi became their first and most familiar environment. They knew its particular smell, the combination of wood smoke and tanned hide, and the specific scent of their family. They knew the sound of the fire at different levels of burning, and the sounds of their family going about their different activities. They knew where the light came from and how it changed through the day as the sun moved around the outside and the angle of the light through the smoke hole shifted. They knew the feel of the fur robes against their skin and the softness of the sleeping place that was theirs. In the evenings, children listened to the stories that adults told around the fire. The stories came in many forms and served many purposes. They were entertaining, yes, and children delighted in the narrative pleasures of a well-told tale, the rhythm of the telling, the familiar characters and situations, the moments of wonder or gentle humor. But the stories were also educational in the deepest sense, carrying knowledge of the land, of proper relationships between people and animals, of the principles that guided a good life. Children absorbing these stories were absorbing the understanding of their world, taking in through story what could not always be conveyed through direct instruction. As the evening lengthened and the fire burned lower, children would grow sleepy, leaning against the adults beside them, their eyes growing heavy, the words of the story becoming a gentle murmur at the edge of their awareness. Gradually, they would be settled into their sleeping places, arranged comfortably in their robes, perhaps with a soft word or a hand laid gently on their back, and they would drift into sleep, while the adults continued talking quietly in the firelit lodge. During the night, a sleeping child might occasionally stir, wake briefly, and find themselves in the warm, familiar dark of the lodge, surrounded by the breathing of their family and the faint glow of the embers. In most cases, this brief waking would be very short, a moment of awareness, a comfortable recognition of where they were and who was near, and then a drifting back into sleep as easy as water finding its level. Daily winter routines, the daily rhythm of winter life, in and around the tipi, had a particular quality of steadiness and repetition that, far from being monotonous, provided a structure within which each day's small variations and small satisfactions could be felt clearly. The morning began with the rebuilding of the fire. However well the fire had been managed through the night, the coals by morning were lower and the lodge somewhat cooler than it had been in the evening. The person who rose first, often one of the adults, sometimes the grandmother or grandfather whose long habit of early waking made them the natural first stirrer, would lean toward the hearth and coax the embers with gentle breath, add small dry sticks, then slightly larger ones, until the fire was burning again with some purpose, its warmth beginning to expand once more through the interior. As the lodge warmed, others would wake in sequence, each person taking their time about it, sitting up within their robe, adjusting to the temperature of the air, the light, the sounds of the morning. There was no particular hurry in a deep winter morning, no sudden demands requiring immediate action. Time could be taken with waking up. A person might sit for a while beside the newly rebuilt fire, wrapped in their robe, simply present, watching the flames and listening to the sounds of the camp beginning to stir outside. Then the morning meal would be prepared. Whatever was available, dried bison meat, pemmican made of dried meat and fat and perhaps dried berries, roots that had been stored in the autumn, would be set to warm or cook at the fire. Pemmican, in particular, was an important winter food, dense with calories from fat and protein, compact to store and carry, and needing only warming to be a satisfying meal. The smell of food warming over the fire was one of the comforting morning scents of the tipi, a signal that the day was properly beginning. After eating, the day's tasks took shape according to what was most needed. On a clear, relatively mild day, more might be done outside, gathering additional firewood, checking on the horses, visiting between lodges, tending to the various outdoor tasks of the camp. On a colder, windier day, more activity would take place inside. Tool repair, hide working, clothing mending, the quiet but essential indoor work that kept the household in good repair. Visiting between lodges was a regular part of winter social life. The camp was a community, and even in winter, perhaps especially in winter with its longer evenings and more confined daily range, the connections between households were maintained through visiting, shared tasks, and the simple pleasure of company. News and knowledge moved through the camp this way. Stories were shared. Skills were taught and learned. The bonds of relationship that held the community together were tended and renewed in these ordinary daily exchanges. Children played together during the daylight hours, inside and around the camp. They had their own games, their own small social world within the larger one of the adults, their own version of the camp's daily life enacted in miniature play. Their energy and their laughter were part of the daily texture of the winter camp, as natural and regular as the smoke rising from the lodges or the sound of dogs settling into their sleeping places in the cold. As afternoon came and the light began its early winter decline, the camp moved toward the quieter rhythms of evening. Firewood was brought inside. The meal for the evening was prepared. People gathered more closely together as the light outside faded, the natural social instinct of drawing toward warmth and company becoming more pronounced as the darkness increased. Voices grew softer. Tasks shifted from the more active to the more contemplative. Stories began. The fire was fed, and the long, comfortable evening hours of the winter tipi began. Cooking inside the tipi, food prepared and shared inside the winter tipi, was simple, nourishing, and deeply satisfying in the way that food is always satisfying when it is prepared with knowledge and care, and eaten in warmth and company. The centerpiece of winter food for many plains peoples was the bison or buffalo in various forms. Fresh bison meat, when available from a recent hunt, was cooked directly over or beside the fire. Pieces of meat might be placed on flat stones beside the coals, where the stones' retained heat would cook them slowly and evenly. Larger pieces could be skewered on sticks and held over the fire or propped in position. The fat of the bison, rendered by the heat, would run across the surface of the meat and drip onto the coals with a brief, fragrant sizzle. Dried bison meat was a staple of the winter, preserved from autumn hunts by slicing the meat thin and drying it in the open air or over a slow fire. This jerky, like dried meat, could be stored for months and reconstituted in hot water, simmered until it became tender and flavored the broth, or simply eaten as it was, its dense, concentrated flavor providing nourishment in a compact and easily prepared form. Pemmican was the winter food that brought together multiple preserved elements. Dried meat, pounded fine, was mixed with rendered bison fat and sometimes dried berries in a ratio that produced a dense, calorie-rich food. Made in the autumn and stored in rawhide containers called parfleches, pemmican could remain edible through the winter months and was one of the most important provisions a well-prepared household could have in reserve. Cooking over the tipi fire was accomplished with several methods. A simple method was the direct fire approach, already described, placing food on or beside the coals or over the flames on a stick or framework. A more controlled method used a hide or stomach pouch as a cooking vessel, filled with water and food, with heated stones dropped in from the fire to bring the water to a boil. This stone boiling technique was effective and required only materials available in the immediate environment. The stones were heated in the fire until very hot, then transferred carefully to the vessel using 2 sticks, and the water quickly came to temperature, cooking the contents gently. Serving food in the tipi was a communal act, the warmth of the food and the warmth of the lodge combining. People ate close together, sharing from common vessels, each person taking what they needed in a manner consistent with the customs of their household and community. Children were served with attention, the smallest ones first tended to before the adults sat to eat. The elders were respected with portions appropriate to their status and their appetite. After eating, the quiet contentment of the tipi in the evening deepened. The work of feeding the household had been done. The fire burned low and steady. The cold outside maintained its patient presence, but here, in the warmth of the lodge, full and comfortable, and together, the cold was only a background awareness, a distant reference that made the warmth within feel all the more welcome. Nighttime sounds on the plains when the camp had fully settled into evening and the last voices had grown soft and infrequent. The sounds of the world outside the tipi became more noticeable. Not alarming sounds, not sharp or sudden ones, but the steady, woven texture of a winter night on the open plains, heard through the filtered quiet of the lodge walls. The wind, if there was wind, was the constant background sound of the plains night. Inside the tipi, the wind became a murmur, a soft rushing and fading, sometimes rising briefly to a higher note when a gust moved through the camp, then dropping again to its steady low voice. The poles of the tipi, settling and shifting very slightly in the wind, might creak faintly, a sound so familiar that it was no more noticed than the sound of one's own breathing. Snow, when it fell, had its own sound. Heavy, soft flakes settling on the outer cover created a gentle, continuous whisper, not quite silence, but close to it, a sound more felt as a dampening of other sounds than heard directly. Occasional small slides of accumulated snow from the steeper upper portions of the cover fell with a soft, padded sound that was not alarming, but simply a small note in the night's quiet music. From somewhere across the plain, the voice of a coyote would rise. This was one of the most characteristic sounds of the plains night, and it was a sound that people had heard all their lives, as familiar as the sound of the river in its banks or the wind in the dry grass. The coyote's call is not a threatening sound. It is a flowing musical sound, sometimes a single long note, sometimes a rapid sequence of shorter calls, and then answering calls from others further away, until there might be a brief, distant chorus that wavered across the darkness for a few moments before fading back into silence. Within the tipi, the sounds were quieter and more intimate. The soft crackle or tick of a coal settling in the hearth, the faint rustle of someone adjusting their robe, the slow, deep breathing of someone already deeply asleep. A dog shifting position at the edge of the sleeping area. These small, domestic sounds were the sounds of safety, of a home functioning as a home should, of people resting securely through the night. Far away, perhaps, across the valley, there might be the sound of a horse moving against its rope, its hooves making quiet indentations in the snow. Or an owl, a great horned owl perhaps, calling from one of the cottonwood trees along the river, its deep, measured voice carrying clearly through the cold air. These were all simply the sounds of the living night, of a world going about its own quiet business in the dark, and hearing them from within the warm tipi gave a sense of connection to that larger world without requiring any response or action. Storytelling and community evenings, the long winter evenings were in many ways the richest time of the year for the community's inner life. When the demands of active outdoor work were reduced by the cold and the dark, and when people were gathered close around their fires with the hours of the night stretching out ahead, there was time and space for the stories that carried everything most important about a people's understanding of themselves and their world. Storytelling was a respected and valued skill. Those who told stories well, who could hold an audience through the long arc of a complex narrative, who could find the right words at the right moments, who could make the familiar feel newly vivid and the distant feel present, were valued contributors to the community's evening life. Elders were often the primary storytellers, drawing on a lifetime of accumulated narrative memory to bring to their grandchildren and other listeners the stories that had been brought to them in their own childhoods by their grandparents. The stories of the Plains peoples were varied in character and purpose. Some were stories of the beginnings of things, how the world was made, how the bison came to be, how certain stars received their names and places in the sky. These stories carried a people's deepest understanding of reality, encoded in narrative form so that it could be held in memory and passed on without writing. They were not fairy tales in the dismissive sense of the word, not invented entertainment, but genuine philosophical and cosmological statements about the nature of existence, wrapped in the memorable and emotionally engaging form of story. Some stories were historical, accounts of events that had shaped the community or its ancestors, told in ways that preserved the memory of those events and the lessons they carried. These stories connected the people of the present to those of the past, giving depth and continuity to their sense of who they were. A child listening to a story about their great-grandmother's courage or their ancestors' wisdom was receiving more than entertainment. They were receiving identity, a place within a lineage that stretched back long before their own birth and would continue long after. Some stories were practical in their content, encoding knowledge about the behavior of animals, the properties of plants, the patterns of the weather, in narrative form that made that knowledge memorable and transmissible. A story about how a certain bird behaved before a storm might carry, within its narrative, genuinely useful meteorological knowledge accumulated over many generations of observation. And some stories were simply delightful, told for the pleasure of telling and hearing, full of characters that made people smile and situations that generated warm laughter around the fire. Humor was as much a part of the evening circle as solemnity, and the ability to make one's listeners laugh was as valued as the ability to move them or instruct them. Children listening to these evening stories were, in many ways, receiving the core of their education. Not education in the narrow sense of skills and techniques, though some stories carried that too, but education in the fullest sense. Learning who they were, where they came from, how the world worked, how people should treat each other and the other beings they lived among, what made a good life. All of this arrived through story, flowing from the elder's voice to the child's listening mind, as naturally as the warmth from the fire flowed through the lodge. As the evening deepened, the stories would grow quieter, the voices of the tellers lower and more measured. The firelight would have softened to its lower, steadier evening level. Children would have gone still beside the adults, some already asleep, some only just barely awake, the story still flowing gently through their half-dreaming minds. Adults, too, would find their eyes growing heavy, their thoughts becoming looser and slower, the story and the fire and the warmth weaving together into the beginning of sleep. How snow actually helped insulation, it might seem, at first thought, that snow was simply an aspect of the cold that needed to be endured. But for people who lived closely with the winter landscape and understood it thoroughly, snow was also a resource, a feature of the season that, properly understood and worked with, could actively contribute to the warmth and comfort of the winter camp. The most direct way that snow helped insulate the tipi was by accumulating against its base. As snow fell and settled, and was supplemented by drifting, it gathered in a soft ring around the perimeter of each lodge. This snow ring was not just an accumulation of cold material. Because of snow's particular physical structure, millions of tiny ice crystals with air trapped between them, it was actually a reasonably effective insulator, blocking wind from entering beneath the lower edge of the tipi cover and reducing the cold air infiltration that would otherwise occur at ground level. People in winter camps were aware of this and often encouraged the accumulation of snow against the tipi base, sometimes adding to it deliberately to close gaps and improve the seal. The combination of the staked outer cover, the weighted inner liner, and the packed snow around the exterior created a base-level seal that significantly reduced the drafts that would otherwise have moved freely across the lodge floor, chilling the sleeping surfaces and making it harder to keep the interior warm. Snow on the ground of the surrounding camp also had an effect on the sound environment of the tipi. Its presence softened and dampened sounds, creating the quieter, more muffled acoustic quality that gave winter nights their particular peaceful character. The sound of footsteps on snow was softer than on hard ground. The sound of wind moving over a snow-covered surface was subtler and less sharp than wind over bare ground. This collective softening contributed to the sense of calm and closure that the winter tipi provided. In particularly cold conditions, some communities would pack snow higher against the tipi walls, creating a banked ring that extended partway up the outside of the cover. This further improved the base insulation and made the interior noticeably warmer. The thick walls of banked snow were slow to transmit temperature change in either direction. They did not warm up quickly in a mild spell, and they did not admit the coldest air during the sharpest cold snaps. Children who grew up in winter camps understood snow in all these dimensions, not as a single, simple thing, but as a material with texture and character and various properties that could be worked with. They knew the difference between wet, heavy snow that stuck together and could be packed and shaped, and the dry, fine, crystalline snow that flew and drifted in the wind but did not bind. They knew how snow settled differently under different temperature and wind conditions. They knew where it would drift and where it would be swept clean by the wind. All of this knowledge was simply part of knowing the winter world, accumulated naturally through years of living within it. Moving camp during winter. The necessity of moving camp during winter, though less frequent than in the traveling seasons of spring and fall, was a reality of the nomadic life of the plains. Whether the need was for better access to game, fresh sources of firewood, more sheltered ground, or water, there were times when even the deep cold of winter required the camp to fold itself and move on. Preparing for a winter move began with the practical tasks of breaking down each tipi. The poles were untied at the top and lowered carefully, each one removed from the bundle and laid together in the sets that would be loaded onto the travois. The cover was unlaced and unpinned, detached from the poles, and folded or rolled for transport. The inner liner was taken down and bundled. Household items were wrapped and packed into the rawhide parfleches and bundles that served as the containers and bags of the plains household. Horses were central to winter moves. Without horses, the long tipi poles, sometimes 8 or 9 meters in length, and the heavy, stiff tipi covers would have been very difficult to transport at all, and certainly not quickly. The travois, a simple frame of poles dragged from the shoulders of a horse, served as the primary transport vehicle of the plains' nomadic life. The tipi poles might be used as the travois poles themselves, making the structure doubly useful. Household items were loaded onto the platform formed between the trailing poles, secured with rawhide rope, and the horse would pull its load across the snow. People on foot, and those riding horses, wrapped themselves carefully for travel. The outer robe was drawn close. Hoods and mittens were worn. Moccasins were checked to make sure they were well fitted and dry. Children too young to walk well might ride on a horse, bundled against the cold, held steady by an adult riding behind them or riding their own gentle mount. Older children and adults moved alongside, their moccasined feet making soft tracks in the snow. The pace of a winter move was measured and steady. There was no benefit to rushing in cold weather. It increased the risk of sweating, which could become a problem if the person then cooled rapidly. The horses moved at a walking pace, the people walking with them, the column of the moving camp leaving a winding track in the snow that the wind would slowly smooth and eventually erase. When the new location was reached, the work of setting up camp began again, almost exactly as it had been done before. Poles sorted and raised, covers stretched and pinned, inner liners hung, hearths prepared, and fires lit. The practiced efficiency of hands that had done this many times was visible in the speed with which the camp could be made habitable again. Within a few hours of arriving at a new site, each lodge would be standing, each fire burning, each household settled again into the familiar warmth and arrangement of their home. The knowledge of how to accomplish all of this in cold conditions, without losing warmth, without allowing materials to be damaged by the cold or the snow, without getting clothing wet through the exertion, and then suffering in the cold. All of this was part of the deep practical wisdom that the people of the plains carried in their bodies and their habits. Respect for nature and seasonal cycles underlying every practical aspect of life on the plains. The design of the tipi, the management of fire, the preparation of hides, the choice of camp locations, the patterns of movement, was a relationship with the natural world that went deeper than simple practicality. The peoples of the plains understood themselves as participants in a larger community of life, one that included not only the people and animals and plants of the immediate environment, but the sky, the rivers, the seasons, and the forces that moved through all of them. Winter was understood as a season with its own character and its own gifts. It was a time of drawing inward, of rest, of reflection, of stories and community. The cold and the snow were not obstacles to be overcome, but features of the world to be engaged with respectfully and skillfully. The bison that sustained life in all seasons were respected and honored not simply because they were useful, but because they were understood as fellow participants in the circle of life, beings with their own place and purpose, to whom the people felt genuine responsibility. This perspective shaped the way resources were used. The bison taken in a hunt was used as fully as possible. The hide for clothing and shelter, the meat for food, the bones for tools, the sinew for sewing, the fat for cooking and for waterproofing hides, the stomach and bladder for containers. Nothing was taken carelessly or wastefully. The relationship with the bison was one of mutual dependency, understood and honored with ceremony and gratitude. The seasonal cycle, the coming of winter, its long, steady presence, and its eventual, gradual giving way to spring, was understood as a pattern with meaning. The turn of the year was marked with attention and ceremony. The returning warmth of spring, the first green of the grasses, the return of the birds, the new calves among the bison herds, all of these were noted and welcomed, not merely as practical improvements in living conditions, but as expressions of the living world continuing its cycle, renewing itself as it always had and always would. Children growing up in this understanding learned from an early age to pay attention to the world around them, to observe the behavior of animals and the patterns of weather and the movements of the stars with the same attentiveness that they brought to learning practical skills. The natural world was their teacher as much as the elders were, and the lessons it offered were available to anyone patient and observant enough to receive them. This relationship with the land and its cycles was expressed in ceremony, in story, in the small daily acts of care and attention that constituted a life lived in conscious relationship with the world. The way a person stepped carefully through a camp to avoid disturbing a sleeping dog. The way food was prepared with attention and shared generously. The way a fire was tended with consistency and respect. All of these small acts were expressions of a larger understanding. That life was not a collection of separate things to be managed independently, but a web of relationships to be maintained with care. Winter, within this understanding, was not a hardship to be survived until something better arrived. It was winter. It was its own thing, with its own beauty, its own particular quality of time, its own role in the larger cycle. The long evenings by the fire were not merely waiting for spring. They were evenings with their own worth, their own pleasures, their own teachings. The deep silence of a snowbound plain was not merely absence of activity. It was a presence, a particular quality of the world worth attending to, worth being quiet enough to receive. And the tipi, standing in that winter landscape, was itself an expression of this relationship. It was made of the land's materials, shaped by the land's conditions, oriented to the land's winds and light, moved with the land's rhythms. It was not imposed on the landscape, but grown from it, the way a bird's nest grows from the materials of its particular tree, shaped by the particular needs and knowledge of the creature who made it. A full night inside a winter tipi, let us come now to the heart of this long evening's journey. Let us step fully and slowly inside one winter tipi, and let the night unfold from beginning to end at its own unhurried pace. The sun has set perhaps 2 hours ago. You cannot see it set from inside the tipi, but you felt the change. The faint light that filtered through the upper smoke hole shifted from pale gold to gray to the soft, uniform dark of night. The sounds outside shifted too, the camp moving from the activity of late afternoon into the quieter rhythms of evening, voices softening, movements slowing, the day completing itself. Inside, the fire has been fed to its evening level, not blazing, but burning steadily with several pieces of good dry wood feeding a set of coals that have been building since morning. The light this fire gives is warm and full, filling the tipi's interior with a soft, moving amber glow. The poles rise above into the dimness, their crossing point at the top just visible in the firelight, the smoke hole beyond them a small, dark circle of night sky where, if you look carefully, a star or two is visible. The inner liner along the walls, reflects the firelight softly, its surface warming the painted or geometric designs into vivid life. The movement of the flames making the designs seem almost animated, as if the horses or geometric forms on the liner were gently breathing. The floor is layered with robes and mats, soft and warm underfoot. The smell of the lodge is the particular and comforting smell of home. Smoke and tanned hide, and the faint, clean scent of cold air held at bay just outside the walls. Around the fire, the household is gathered. The children are here, two of them, a small girl already growing sleepy, leaning against her grandmother's side, her eyes blinking slowly in the firelight. The grandmother's hand rests gently on the child's head, fingers moving in an absent, soft rhythm. Across the fire, a young woman is finishing work on a piece of clothing, her hands moving with quiet efficiency, needle and sinew drawing the final stitches of an evening's sewing. The man of the household is sitting with his back supported by a willow backrest, his robe wrapped around his shoulders, speaking quietly with an older man who has come from the next lodge to visit, their voices low and unhurried, the conversation moving at the pace of the fire. The second child, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 winters, is lying on his sleeping robe near the wall, not yet asleep but resting, his eyes open and soft, watching the shadows move on the liner above him. He has been listening to the adults' conversation without following every word, letting the familiar sound of their voices wash over him like the warmth of the fire. Outside, he hears the sound of the wind moving across the camp, a low and steady murmur. He hears from a little distance the soft sound of a horse shifting its weight in the cold. And then from somewhere across the dark plain, the gentle wavering call of a coyote, rising and holding for a moment, then fading. He feels no alarm at this sound. He has heard it all his life. It is simply one of the voices of the night, speaking from its own world into his. The visiting elder, after a time, rises to go. He wraps his robe more firmly around his shoulders, speaks a quiet word of departure, and lifts the door flap and is gone. The cold air that briefly entered with his passage is quickly absorbed into the warmth of the lodge. The door flap falls back into place. The fire settles slightly, and a small curl of new flame rises where a coal has caught a fresh edge of wood. The grandmother now lifts the small girl gently and carries her the few steps to her sleeping place, laying her down with care on the layered robes, drawing a warm buffalo robe over her small form, tucking it close. The child murmurs something, already more than half asleep, and is still. The grandmother sits for a moment beside her, one hand resting gently on the robe, and there is a stillness between them that is one of the most peaceful things in this peaceful world. The young woman folds her sewing, sets aside her needle, and stretches her arms and neck with the quiet satisfaction of finished work. She speaks a few soft words to her husband, and he responds, and they are comfortable in the ordinary closeness of two people who know each other well and are easy in each other's company. After a time, she moves to the sleeping side of the lodge and begins to prepare her own rest, arranging her robes, removing her outer moccasins, settling in with the practiced efficiency of many such nights. The man tends the fire. He does not add large pieces of wood now. The night is well along, and a deep bed of coals will hold the warmth better through the dark hours than a blazing fire. He pushes the remaining pieces of wood slightly together, draws 2 smooth stones closer to hold the heat, and observes with satisfaction the steady glow of the coals. The smoke above the fire is almost invisible now, a faint movement in the air rather than a visible column, drifting upward so gently that it seems barely different from the air itself. He glances at the smoke flap poles leaning near the door, confirms that they are set at the angle he adjusted them to an hour ago, and nods slightly to himself, the small internal acknowledgement of a task properly completed. Then he too moves to his sleeping place, settles into his robes, and lies still. The lodge is quiet now. All four people breathe in the warm air of the tipi, each in their own sleeping place, each wrapped in the soft weight of their robes. The fire breathes too, in its own way, a slow pulse of light and heat from the deep coals. Occasionally a coal will release a faint sound, a tick or a soft settling, and the light will shift briefly, then return to its steady glow. The snow outside is falling again now, very gently. You can hear it only as a very slight change in the quality of the sound against the outer cover, a barely perceptible softening of the already soft night sounds. The snow is accumulating in its slow and patient way, adding to the ring around the tipi's base, closing any small remaining gaps, insulating the lodge from the cold ground and the cold air. The tipi stands in its circle of snow, its poles steady, its fire low and warm within, its sleeping people resting in the deep, unhurried sleep of those who are safe and warm and home. The hours of the night move in their own long, untroubled way. There is no marking of them, no clock, no bell. Time in this lodge is felt rather than measured. The gradual dimming of the coals, the deepening of the cold outside that reaches its lowest point in the hours before dawn, the slow wheeling of the stars above the smoke hole. Once, in the middle of the night, the woman wakes briefly, sits up, adds two small pieces of wood to the coals with quiet, practiced hands, watches for a moment as they catch, then lies back down and is asleep again within moments. The fire accepts this care and burns a little more brightly, its warmth spreading again through the still air of the lodge. The children sleep without waking. Their breathing is the deepest, slowest sound in the tipi, the breathing of bodies fully committed to rest, fully trusting in the warmth around them. The grandmother sleeps on her side, her form a rounded shape beneath her robe. The man lies on his back, his face turned slightly toward the fire, its low light touching his closed eyes. Outside, the coyote calls once more, very far away now, a thin thread of sound across the vast dark. The snow continues its patient, wordless falling. The horses stand in their places, their thick winter coats holding their warmth, their breathing steady clouds in the cold. The camp as a whole is a small gathering of warmth and life in the open plain, each lodge a pocket of fire and breath and rest, the whole circle of them together making something larger than any individual lodge could be, a community at rest in the winter night, connected by proximity and by relationship, and by the shared knowledge of how to live well in this particular place and season. The night moves toward its deepest hour. The coals in the hearth glow their quietest red. The air in the lodge is cool above and warm below, the gradient exactly as it should be for comfortable sleeping. Every sound is a small and gentle one. Every breath is slow. And then, much later, in the deepest part of the early morning, when the darkness outside is at its fullest and the cold at its sharpest, a very subtle shift begins. It is not visible. It is not audible. It is simply a quality of the air, a direction in which time is moving, that those who have slept outside through many winters know without knowing how they know it. The night has reached its deepest point. From here, almost imperceptibly, it begins its slow turn toward morning. The coals still glow. The people still sleep. The snow still falls or has stopped, leaving the camp in a deep and particular stillness. But somewhere in the east, beyond the hills, beyond the flat plain, the darkness has begun its first, barely perceptible softening, as it always does, as it has always done, as it will continue to do long after this particular winter night has joined all the other winter nights in the long, unhurried memory of the land. Gentle closing reflection, let us rest here for a moment, in this last quiet section, before the story releases us gently into our own sleep. What the peoples of the plains created in their winter tipis was something that no single word quite captures. It was shelter, yes. It was warmth. It was engineering in the most practical and effective sense. But it was also something else, a way of being in a difficult environment that did not require that the environment be changed or overcome, but only understood and worked with, season by season, generation by generation, with patience and intelligence and care. The tipi carried within its design the accumulated knowledge of many lifetimes. Every dimension of it, the angle of the poles, the placement of the smoke hole, the hang of the inner liner, the orientation of the door, reflected generations of observation and refinement, people noticing what worked and what worked better, adjusting and improving and passing on what they had learned. The result was a home that was, in the best sense of that word, beautifully suited to the life it sheltered. And the warmth inside that tipi was not only the warmth of fire and hide and carefully managed air. It was the warmth of community, of grandparents and grandchildren sleeping in the same lodge, of stories told and listened to across the fire, of hands working quietly at shared tasks, of food prepared and shared with care. The physical warmth and the human warmth were inseparable in the winter tipi. Each reinforced the other. Together, they made something that was genuinely, deeply comfortable in the fullest sense of that word. As you lie in your own warmth tonight, in your own bed, you might let yourself hold that image for a moment. A tipi on a wide winter plain, its shape steady against the falling snow, its fire low and warm within, its people sleeping in the deep contentment of those who are home. The snow is drifting softly outside. The coyote's voice has faded into the distance. The stars above the smoke hole are very bright and very still. The fire inside dims a little more, the coals settling into their deepest, quietest red. The breathing in the lodge slows to its slowest rhythm. The snow falls. The night holds everything gently, and the plains stretch out in all directions, wide and white and still, as they have always stretched, patient and beautiful and exactly as they are meant to be. Sleep now. Let the night carry you where it will. Thanks for listening to Ancient Lives for Sleep.